Hi, Leeza. A very warm welcome from somebody who you spoke to a long, long time ago. And of course, we never got down to having that chat that we were meant to have at that point of time. But I'm glad to have you here. Welcome to PanACEa Asexuality Asia Conference 2021. This is the first time we're doing something like this. This is the first time an event of this scale is happening at all on the topic of asexuality in Asia. And considering I have always received you as an ally of the asexual community, I am so glad to have you here. Welcome again.
Thank you so much for having me. And I so admire the work that you do. And I am so grateful that you consider me an ally. I'm honored to be talking to you.
Lovely. So, a quick introduction of Leeza from my end before I let Leeza introduce herself is that Leeza is a digital content creator who's been writing and producing videos for a very long time. I believe it started with YouTube, and Leeza talks about a lot of very sensitive topics and handles them beautifully. She invites a lot of guests. She talks about diverse range of topics, going from sex, sexuality, all sorts of taboo topics that India, unfortunately, has never had people talking about. And finally, we are talking about them, especially coming from a woman. The lens that it lends to those conversations is something that India has been asking for and needing for a really long time. And finally, we have it in the form of a few creators such as Leeza. So, Leeza, how would you like to introduce yourself?
Thanks for that very kind introduction. Pragati, I think that you've basically said what I do. So, I don't have much to add. I do primarily create digital content around sex and sexuality and sexual health, and the digital medium is now pretty much the main format within which I've started to do the work. I've used to write more and things like that. And I actually am working on a book. But I think that young people seem to really enjoy video content, and I'm able to reach the maximum number of people via video. And I want it to be free and accessible. And so, yeah, that's the format I've been using the most. And I'm really excited that one of the nice sort of silver linings to all the doom and gloom of the pandemic was that more and more people were able to connect virtually. And I'm so glad conversations like this are happening with people all over the world. We sure need to talk more about sexuality in all its forms, right? And in India for sure, but everywhere, I think. So thanks so much for doing this conference. I'm so happy to see this type of thing happening.
Thanks again, Leeza. So, before anything else, I wanted to introduce the audience to the topic that we're going to be handling today. It's a topic that has been spoken about at length in the recent years. A lot of people speak about the idea and the concept of consent, especially when it comes to sexual consent, consent in relationships, intimate partner consent, and so on and so forth. However, I feel like concepts, even as generic as consent, have a lot of specific undertones when it comes to certain contexts, certain identities, certain communities. And so we're going to try and delve a little deeper and try to explore what consent really means in different identities, communities, and contexts. Leeza is somebody who's been talking about consent for a very long time, from what I understand. And I want to be able to take from what Leeza knows now, the insight that Leeza has now after talking about this topic for a number of years, and how we can try to maybe put together something which highlights those nuances, those complexities of what consent even means in specific scenarios. So before anything else, let's set the stage a little bit. Leeza, would you like to describe your idea of consent? How do you define it? What are the pillars of this concept?
I think that in theory, the idea of consent seems very simple, right? In theory, the dictionary defines it as to simply agree to do something or to give permission to do something. But I think in practice, and particularly in relationships and in sexual relationships or sexual encounters, consent can be much trickier to navigate because um, as sex educators, we're given these sort of slogans to try and teach young people about consent, such as only yes means yes, and no means no, but really navigating consent in those situations with another human being, with all the sort of multitude of emotions that you feel during a sexual encounter, whether it's nervousness or excitement or fear, or, you know, maybe you're not even entirely sure how you feel. So it isn't as easy as just yes or no, right? And I think that often these conversations in sort of campaigns or sex education context or Instagram or whatever, while well intentioned, and while I think these slogans have some merit, they aren't enough. I mean, I think we do have to be having, you know, really heartfelt and really sort of deeper, longer, more um, you know, participatory conversations around consent, because I think there is a lot of room that remains difficult to define and difficult to navigate. How can we make room for maybe? How can we make room for I'm not sure, I need more time? You know, I think yes and no aren't as easy to say as they sound. I mean, we've probably all been in situations where we've conceded to doing something we didn't really want to do. It needn't even have to be a sexual situation. It could be any kind of situation, but whether it's for our own safety or whether we fear being judged or whether we don't want to hurt someone, we've probably said yes to something when we didn't mean yes. So only yes means yes, you know, isn't entirely accurate, right? Sometimes you can say yes when actually you don't want to be doing that thing. And similarly, I feel like on the other hand, you can maybe want to do something but you're afraid of being judged or shamed, etc., etc., and so maybe you're not so forthcoming when you do want to do something. I've I think denied advances sometimes because I don't want to be perceived as easy, or you know, something like that. I mean, where it's hard not to be on some level impacted by the cultural sort of judgments and slut shamey behavior kind of concerns, right? No matter how progressive you want to be. And so I think it's really important that we think about those things. That can we always say what we mean? How can we make it easier to say what we mean? You know, I think we're also really struggling for the most part at receiving no's. We're not very good at dealing with rejection, right? But we're also not very kind when we reject. And I feel like it's something that we need to get better at on both ends, right? Instead of feeling a shame or anger or some sort of like desire for revenge when someone says they don't want to do something you want to do, instead you should feel gratitude that they're honoring their own boundaries. And likewise, if someone wants to do something with you, wouldn't it be nice if they could express that respectfully, and if you could turn them down also respectfully if you're not interested? I feel like how can we bring respect and empathy and kindness and patience and sort of a willingness to listen a little bit before acting, instead of this sort of compulsion to know exactly what you want immediately and to be super clear. And you know, I think it's much harder in practice than it is in theory to actually be so articulate immediately. And I think we'd all really benefit a lot from giving each other more space and time and sort of safety within which to consider how we want to proceed in our relationships and in our sexual encounters.
What a lovely start to the conversation, Leeza. There's something very specific that you said that I'm a little stuck on, and it's because it's a very controversial statement for me to make, for anybody to make, maybe possibly, but it is true, and I think we need to make space for difficult conversations on a constant basis. And so I'm going to highlight that just a little bit for everybody to mull over, and do share your thoughts in the comment box if you have something to say about what I'm going to say, or anything that Leeza is saying either. So a lot of, and I'm going to be speaking in gender binaries just for this, because that is how we've grown up seeing media, right? So in media, what we see is that the man pursues and the woman rejects for a while, and then lets the man in, right, into her life, or into her private space, into her romantic space, so on and so forth. And so I feel like while it is true that many men are conditioned to keep pursuing, even when the girl has said or the woman has said no multiple times. It's also true, maybe, and I'll let you inform me if you think this is right or wrong, that a lot of women also get conditioned to say no when they want to say yes. It's also true that it works the other way around also. A lot of women will end up saying yes when they want to say no, but can we also consider the possibility that maybe women are also getting conditioned to say no when they want to say yes, because they don't want to be perceived as easy, they don't want to be slut shamed, they're conditioned to first say no a few times and only then say yes. So just wanted to bring that out because I think you touched upon it, and I think it talks about one of the nuances around consent that is less spoken about.
Yeah, I think that the conditioning around gender roles and the heteronormative scripts we're fed about how sex should pan out tend to posit men as necessary sexual predators and women as necessary sexual gatekeepers. And this is a really problematic conditioning that actually benefits nobody. And just as it's difficult for women to say no, right? There's obviously the prevailing issue of violence against women, gendered violence, sexual violence against women, and women and queer people's agency and autonomy is, disproportionately targeted in a patriarchal society. However, it is also very difficult for a man to say no, right? When you think about constructions of masculinity, and this is not me sympathizing. I mean, I understand that the fear of violence doesn't exist for men at the hands of women quite the way it does for women at the hands of men because of I think you don't need me to explain that. However, I think that the construction of masculinity within a heteronormative framework posits the man as somebody who should always be up for sex, should always want it, and can never say no to it, right? We ridicule and make fun of men who don't want sex. And I think that men might often hesitate to turn down a sexual encounter, even though they should obviously have equal right to to say no if they don't want to do it. So I feel like just as consent, the constructions around heteronormativity and the patriarchal sort of gender roles certainly don't serve women and queer people. Actually, they don't serve straight men either. I think men just don't give them, they just haven't thought about it enough and seem so vociferously to want to defend their, status quo because they think it benefits them, but it doesn't. It really doesn't. And I think that consent really, should matter no matter your gender. I think that it would be great if we could safely and honestly say what we are feeling without having to worry for what's going to happen to us or how we'll be perceived in whatever our answer or whatever our response, right? And I think that comes partly also with an ability to feel no expectation, right? If I can tell you I like you, I can't expect you to like me back, but hopefully you won't ridicule me either. And similarly, if you tell me you like me and I don't really want to do it, wouldn't it be nice if I could express that again without fearing that you're going to hurt me, and also without being unnecessarily cruel to you in the way that how can we cultivate like radical kindness, regardless of our gender? I think that we'd all benefit so much from a culture that honors boundaries and that considers autonomy and agency as valuable. And I really think that we need to get better at talking about sex, and we also need to get better at valuing consent, because especially in the South Asian context, but also in many cultural contexts all over the world, I think that for young people, you kind of grow up with your consent never really mattering. From what you eat to what you wear to who you marry to whatever stuff at work, etc., etc. Your authority figures are constantly making decisions for you. And the family unit and parents, particularly in South Asian and similar cultures, play such a big role in your decision making as a young person, right? It almost doesn't matter what you want. Some other person, normally your dad or mom, and then your boss, and then your your husband, I don't know. All of these people end up having their say or their preferences matter more than yours, especially if you're a woman. But I think even, I mean, for, you know, as young people across the board, I think you're kind of beholden to your parents well into adulthood, which means that when you're coming of age and entering like your first romantic relationships or whatever, you haven't had that much practice with your own boundaries or autonomy being valued or respected, you know? So I wish that we could make consent matter and sort of be a part of our daily interactions in all aspects of life, and not only with people. I think we're very good at, you know, being nice to people more powerful than us or when it stands to benefit us, but we're not very good at valuing the preferences, needs, and requirements of people who seem beholden to us, whether that's our kids or our staff or, you know, anybody, wherever there's a power dynamic. I think we should be particularly mindful of consent, especially if you're in the position of greater power. So yeah, I mean, sorry, I'm rambling. It's kind of, sorry, but it's actually a little disorienting. I can't see you because I feel like I'm just talking to myself.
Oh, how come?
So
Why can't you see me?
I don't know. I guess
Can you
I'm
not see me still?
speaker spotlight.
Oh, yeah.
But since I'm looking at my screen and my own face is so big, I'm sorry, but it's actually a little disorienting because I feel like I'm not sure who I'm speaking to. But so I keep going. But maybe we could, if I can request, I'd love to be able to see you. So then,
Sure. Katha, can you do that, please?
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Okay. So there are so many things that you said that I want to go back to and try to, like, you know, like thread it out a little bit more, maybe possibly. At least three things that stood out for sure that I wanted to talk about. One was the fact that you talked about, you know, how there's this burden on men to always be ready, always be good to go. And interestingly, we talk a lot about this when it comes to asexuality, you know, because as a almost like a blanket rule, what happens across the world when you come to you read up any kind of survey of asexual people, or any survey on study on the asexual community demographics, you'll see that men form a smaller percentage than what you would have expected by large. It's not a tiny difference, it's a huge difference. And the common hypothesis within most ACE circles, most ACE academicians and researchers, is that that entire expectation of the hypersexualized man probably has some role to play, if not all, the entire role to play, in not just making it difficult for a man to say they might be asexual on a survey, but also for the man to be able to come to terms with their own asexuality within themselves, right? And maybe then, if you really think about it like that, it shouldn't be so surprising that regardless of where or in what context these studies have been done, it's always a stark, disproportionate amount of men that seem to appear as and seem to identify as asexual in these studies. So I think I fully agree with what you said about, you know, that expectation, that burden of men never getting to say no without being ridiculed for it. I think there's a lot of overlap between that and this. The second thing that you said, you know, something about a lot of South Asian cultures just never having that culture of autonomy given to young people. And again, it has little to do with sexual autonomy, more to do with the concept of autonomy in general. Yesterday, we were speaking to David J. and David J. is the founder of AVEN and somebody who's led the entire movement of asexuality for a long time now, but in the Western context. And all of this work that I've been doing around asexuality for the last 7 to 8 years has made me realize that there's a stark difference between how this identity or this cause is approached in the West, which is very identity focused, versus how it is approached or needs to be approached in Asian contexts, in Asian cultures, right? Because for a Western white person, the biggest struggle is coming to terms with their identity. Once they've got that figured out, everything else can be managed. However, in India or in most South Asian and Asian cultures, regardless of whether or not you understand your identity, your life's still going to have so many more hurdles beyond that. There's this concept of arranged marriages, forced marriages, marital rape, compulsory expectation of childbirth, all of these things that I don't think a lot of our Western counterparts understand. And that is kind of unique to our Asian cultures, right? There is no autonomy. People, especially for women, it takes them decades to really come to terms with the fact that their body has always been their own, or that they have the right on their bodies. So that again, I'm glad that you brought that up, and I'm glad that we get to touch upon it again. This overlap, I think, helps weave
That
things
said,
out much more clearly.
On the point of that, I do want to just have people think about the fact that, I mean, I don't think you meant it this way, but that people might interpret it this way. Like, I think sometimes it can be presented as if, the West is so great and the East is so backward. And that's not really the case. First of all, we've inherited so much of this baggage from colonialism. Thank you, Western world, for leaving us with your 18th century morality. You know what I mean? I feel like this whole super heteronormative, marriage-focused idea of how sex is legitimate only within a man and a woman in a marriage, and the very sort of binary construction of gender and all of this is such a sort of colonial inheritance to a large extent, because our own cultures actually very often, and in South Asia and India and across Asia, actually, there's so much evidence for constructions of sexuality and gender that were much more fluid and much more sex positive, right? So I feel like we've got to really think about how we, at any given time, how we have come to think about things a certain way. How many of those things actually serve us? How many of those were just planted for us, whether by, the cultural environment or family or religion or whatever other forces, colonialism, blah, 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 that might be at play, and how many actually reflect your own true sort of vision for yourself or sense of self or whatever it is, right? I mean, what you were saying about how masculinity being constructed in this way that, like, a masculine man should want sex must make it difficult for people to come to terms with their own asexuality. I think similarly, even heterosexuality, most of us inherit compulsory allosexuality, I guess, and then also compulsory heterosexuality, right? I think it takes some unpacking to really come to terms with how you're feeling, if there's any sort of contradiction there. And many people don't even give themselves the chance or don't have an environment within which they can acknowledge those feelings, right? We just so often, I don't know, I think we'd all probably be much less rigid. This is a safe space and in a smaller group, I hope I can say this. I might not say this publicly out loud, but I think if we gave ourselves a little more time and space and thought and didn't fear shame and judgment, suddenly everybody's sexuality and gender might seem much less rigidly defined than it might feel today. There's so many gender stereotypes, even though I currently identify as a woman, that I don't particularly feel the need to conform to. I don't aspire for marriage or motherhood. Maybe I have my hair long, but it doesn't mean that every single expectation of what it means to be a woman is something that resonates with me. And similarly, I've been heterosexual up to now, but I really do think, the more I think about it, that I could certainly feel attraction for somebody of the same gender or any number of genders. So I feel like, personally, at least, since I can't speak for everybody, I've only begun examining certain ideas that I thought were reflective of who I am, but actually I had simply inherited from a largely heteronormative society, patriarchal society, that only at 30 or whatever, I'm 31 now, do you begin to even have the space or time or freedom or privacy to contemplate. So sorry, but yeah, no, I was trying to say that East and West, I'm not.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
That the East is necessary. I think there's differences in this cultural context. It's nice to be sensitive to, but I think in many ways, actually, there's similar problems all over the world with the agency and autonomy of women and queer people, and anybody who's not a straight man, essentially, always being at the sort of end of the priority list in a world that is still currently, I think, largely patriarchal and largely sex negative, you know? I mean, look at the abortion
Mm-hmm.
laws in the US, or when you look at the state of sex education, even in most countries, it's you know, it isn't actually that great, even in the West. And I wonder whether sometimes the definition of like sex positivity can be misconstrued often in societies where it's very seemingly progressive. There's almost this pressure now, right, to like have lots of sex and be on dating apps and have like plastic surgery to get your body to look perfect. And we wear them, you know, I feel like there's almost a hypersexuality that's imposed as the default. I'm not shaming it. I'm not, you know, and I think if you want to do something, by all means, but suddenly, like, you know, we're seeing, I don't know, terminology from porn being used by teenagers in this way where they feel pressurized. I hear young teenagers being like, I went on a first date and he wants to choke me. Is that okay? They DM me this stuff, you know. I feel like perhaps a hypersexuality fueled by access to pornography and all this other stuff without adequate examination isn't necessarily the utopia that we're trying to work towards either, right? I think we're still in all contexts kind of missing sufficient autonomy, agency, compassion, kindness, like acknowledging the fact that we're minds and bodies, not just bodies. Do you know what I mean? I think there's dissonance between like the mental, emotional, and spiritual sort of aspects of a relationship and sex from just the physical act. Often in sort of sex positive conversations, I feel like we don't adequately acknowledge the fact that we're like complex beings, you know. How do you really separate my emotions and my mind from my body? So sorry, I feel like I'm rambling a bit here, but I think there's so much to talk about. And I think it's never either or good or bad, or right or wrong, or like east or west, you know. I'm really a huge believer of like trying to think in a both and sort of a way instead of a either or sort of a way.
No, me too. I'm a big fan of the grays and the indeterminate spaces between the black and whites. Completely agree with you on that. And that thing that you brought up, you know, about the sexual liberation movement. It's something that I feel very passionately about, in the sense that I've written about it a little bit, and I talk about it in safe spaces, so to say. Uh, that while the sexual liberation movement has been incredibly empowering in many ways, I feel like they've left out some of us, and the people that they've left out are the people who might actually, for XYZ reason, not want to be empowered through sex. Maybe there are other ways to get empowered. Somehow it seems like today the empowered woman, especially, is the woman who is freely having sex. What about the woman who's freely not having sex or does not want to have sex? Somehow our association is that to be sex positive, you have to be having sex yourself, and a lot of it, and a lot of diverse kinds of sex, to be genuinely liberated and empowered and sex positive. And I feel like it definitely has some bearing on what you said, the examples that you gave about this young girl who came back from a date and is asking you if it's okay for the guy to want to choke her on the first date, or perhaps the surgeries that you mentioned, all of those things. I completely, fully agree with that. I do think, and this is something that you touched upon right before we started this live, about how slut shaming has been a culture for so long. It still continues, but it is something that has been, to some extent, countered by this sexual liberation movement. However, on the flip side of it, there is still a lot of virgin shaming that happens that nobody really talks about. That doesn't really have a term.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Leeza.
No, please, sorry. No, I mean, I just feel so, I resonate with what you're saying so much. And I think it's so important that we, just as we shouldn't slut shame, we also shouldn't virgin. I mean, I think that to reach a point of not judging people's sexualities and personal lives and relationship structures and all of that is where we want, for me, like the vision is to try and remove shame from the way that we think of and operate when it comes to sexuality, right? Whether you want to have sex or not have sex, whether you want to have lots of sex or you want to have no sex or whatever it is, how do we get to a place where you can do so as you please without being, firstly, without your decision being made for you, and secondly, without feeling shame about the way you want, I mean, I feel like I'm being a little inarticulate here, but to eradicate the shame would be so ideal, I think, as opposed to providing any ideal way to behave sexually. It is simply to eradicate, to remove the shame that is sort of just cast upon you before you can even make any decisions about your sexuality. I think there's such an inherent association with shame that it becomes, you have lots of sex in your shame, you have no sex in your shame. I mean, it's just like,
No, you're exactly, and I feel like at least some of it comes from our just inability to accept normal variance in people's desires and preferences and ways of living life. We just seem to move from one rigid understanding of what it means to be empowered and good and having a good life to another, but we're still being rigid. Where is that space for people to breathe and to be different? Where is that space for people to have very diverse expectations and wants from their lives? And I think that is where the crux of this entire conundrum of moving from slut shaming to virgin shaming is, because it's just making something the enemy, but there's always one enemy. There's never, you're never able to see people as people despite them being so different from you, I think. Glad, Leeza, that we agree on that. But coming back maybe briefly to touch upon consent, I wanted to ask you, of course, maybe if you would want to describe the concept in itself, and then maybe move on to talk about how consent might be functioning in unique ways in the Asian context. If you think there's something that's very unique to Indian context, please do share.
I mean, I think we touched a little bit upon that in terms of how, family decisions are kind of made in a collective capacity within families, particularly, rather than really valuing young people's autonomy. But I think, I mean, if we're on the topic of just consent, I can share a framework that kind of helps understanding consent in sexual situations a little bit. So sorry, I'm always so disoriented when I suddenly see myself on the screen. I'm talking to myself. But Pragati, can I talk to you? I'm so sorry. Thank you.
Yes,
It's
yes.
so large, and I have nowhere else to look, and I'm like making eye contact with myself, which is very odd. So I really like the Planned Parenthood prize model of consent. I think it's a helpful way of just thinking about consent, a sort of consent 101, if you will. Prize being an acronym like FRIES. So the idea is that consent should always be freely given, not coerced, not coaxed. It isn't consent if you put an ultimatum on someone and make them agree with you, right? So freely given, reversible. Just because I said that I will want to do something tomorrow, when tomorrow arrives and I'm not really feeling up to it, I should be able to say so. Or at any point, consent can be withdrawn, right? It's also, just because I consented to something once, it doesn't mean I consent to it forever, or that you can do whatever you like whenever you like because we kissed that one time, right? So freely given and reversible. I is informed. So consent needs to be informed in that if, for example, one party is under the influence of a substance, or, for whatever reason, doesn't understand exactly what you're saying and agrees to doing something, then that isn't informed consent, right? Similarly, if, for example, you withhold information about your sexual health, if you say you've been tested when you haven't been tested for sexually transmitted infections, and thereby convince somebody to have unprotected intercourse with you, or if you, secretly remove a condom during sex, things like that, it ends up being non-consensual because it wasn't informed consent, right? If I consent to sex with a condom, I am not consenting to sex without a condom. So when you remove a condom, then that is a violation of my consent. E is enthusiastic. So the idea is that it's nice to be able to pay attention to how someone is indicating whether they want to do something or not, because sometimes saying nothing or sort of being hesitant, it's much, much safer to see that as a no than to see that as a yes. So when somebody doesn't say something or seems a little bit reluctant, just it's far, far better not to do anything than to think that you have the license to do something because they didn't say no. So unless it's an enthusiastic and, unless both parties seem willing, genuinely willing, it's better not to do anything than to assume a willingness when you're unsure. I think enthusiastic can be kind of ambiguous sometimes, or people have. I feel like there's some pushback against that idea of enthusiasm. Sometimes couples, for example, in a longer-term relationship, have struggled to. I mean, I don't know. I see these conversations around things like scheduling sex or trying to rekindle intimacy in a long-term relationship, which try and kind of push for a more emotionally vast spectrum of possibilities during sex, that you could potentially consent to sex even if you're maybe feeling sad at the time, because sex can make you feel closer. So I don't know. I think for young people, though, I think it is helpful to think of enthusiasm as a benchmark for whether or not someone wants to do something, because typically we're navigating consent in less well-established relationships where there's less well-established communication between two people, right? So I still think enthusiastic is helpful. So freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. If I consent to one activity, doesn't mean I've consented to something else by implication, right? Some people think I let you buy me a drink, so now I've consented to going home with you. No, right? Or if you consent to a kiss, it doesn't mean you've consented to sex or whatever it is, right? Consent is specific. So freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, specific is the Fry's model of consent. And I think it's quite helpful, especially for people who are, navigating their first sort of adult explorations and might not be entirely familiar with the nuances of how things work. It can be confusing to a teenager, particularly, right? I think alcohol, for example, is often something that features in young people's first experiences, and this, I think it's good to be mindful of the fact that that can complicate things. And same with all of the others. I mean, unfortunately, I feel like our egos and how we feel about ourselves, we're kind of conditioned to tie that into how desirable or not, or like how, I mean, we end up taking a lot of things very personally as young people, taking rejection very personally, not being very good at handling no's, and things like that. And I feel like if we could talk about this stuff when, openly at school, at home, and make it such that nobody ever feels like they can't be honest, or that they have to fear for their safety and therefore just say something or go ahead with it. Wouldn't it be nice if we could detach our egos from this and just cultivate this radical sense of like, you should always be kind to each other, always be respectful of each other, always be mindful of each other's comfort, safety, and boundaries. And if we could do that for each other, like, I mean, it sounds so easy. I know it's very hard, but I wish we could do that for each other instead of only thinking of oneself. Like, have a very empathetic and compassionate approach to navigating relationships.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It makes me wonder about something specific though. Like most of these models of consent, um, they seem to again come from the West, right? Like now, all of these components, while they sound like they would make up for the ideal scenario where somebody can look for those components to consent being given to them before proceeding to do something. Here's what I'm wondering. I'm wondering if we are in our cultures, in our Asian cultures, um, trained or so to say conditioned to be even giving consent in that way. Forget asking for consent or looking for consent. Let's again talk in binaries, and let's think of a very classic scenario of a man pursuing a woman. Mm, and if you're telling men to look for these components for it to qualify as consent, right? Um, are the women, are the girls really conditioned to give consent in this way is something that I'm wondering about, because I do understand this for sure that the way people do relationships in our culture is so drastically different from the Western culture. And most of these models and understanding of what consent is seem to come from the West. Do they really apply directly to our Asian cultures? Do you think they need to be contextualized? What are your thoughts on this? Anybody else in the audience also, if you have any thoughts, please to share in the chat box with us.
I think, unfortunately, in our context, even the law, for example, seems to suggest that for women, well, firstly, that sex is only, in general, I would say in many South Asian cultures and even other parts of the world, but in Asia and the Middle East and Africa, I mean, many places, maybe even in some parts of the Western world, there's actually, I would say globally, there's a hierarchy of acceptability when it comes to sex, right? I think Gail Rubin posited this idea several decades ago, but basically sex is the most acceptable. The pinnacle of acceptability is within the context of a heterosexual marriage, right? In the Indian context, within a same caste, same religion, opposite sex marriage. And then everything else falls short, right? Even masturbation is somehow less acceptable, even though that's probably the safest and most hassle-free way of experiencing sexual pleasure, in that it has no danger of pregnancy or infection. It is still considered lesser than in the context of acceptable or respectable ways to experience sexual pleasure when compared to sex within an endogamous marriage. And then within that context, I mean, marital rape is legal in our country, right? So sex is seen as a site of duty within a marriage, only within a marriage, acceptable within a marriage, and then as something that the wife owes the husband, right? It's also very gendered laws where it's assumed that a victim of sexual violence is always going to be a woman, for the most part, in these types of laws around things like marital rape and domestic violence and this, and it's always worded that the woman is the victim. And while statistically that tends to be true, firstly, all relationships are not heterosexual, and secondly, some people might not identify as man or woman or whatever other, I mean, based on the context, anybody could technically be a victim of sexual violence, right? And we should have our laws accommodate for that. But also, why is marital rape still legal? I mean, culturally, we're still presenting this idea that, the woman's consent doesn't really matter, right? I mean, that's within that law. If we are in a society where sex is only acceptable within marriage, but then within marriage, there's no distinction between consensual and non-consensual sex. I mean, what is the cultural message then, right? So I think I'm sorry, trigger warning, but I'm not talking about experiences of these things. I'm only talking about the laws and in general terms. So I hope that was okay. But if anyone wants to leave the chat or isn't comfortable, we can give 30 seconds to people.
Don't worry about it, Leeza. In any case, I mean, we are going to be talking about a lot of difficult topics. So I think it's all right to get into things that might be difficult to hear as well. And about what you said.
In general terms, not sharing any actual descriptions of or experiences of any kind of assault, but like mentions of maybe the law or general attitudes to the ideas of consent violations might be discussed, just as a heads up, to at least from my side. I don't know if you want to share anything that might be we might want to give a content warning about, but at least from my side, that's it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Likewise. In fact, I was about to talk a little bit about the fact that our law doesn't recognize marital rape as rape, has been very clearly stated by our judicial bodies. And the reason attributed to it is very simply the fact that they say this very clearly, and it surprises most other people, that they know that a lot of Indian families will just break down if marital rape was started to be recognized as rape. And so in order to protect that institution of marriage, that institution of that unit of a man and a woman and their children, and to continue the legacy of hundreds of years of India having the lowest divorce rates and the highest rates of marriages continuing to be successful, It's all done in the interest of that, nothing else. The interest of women seems to come right at the bottom of everything else, right? The interest of the state, the interest of the country, the interest of the law, the interest of the institution of marriage, the institution of family, everything supersedes the interest of the safety or the bodily integrity of a woman in this country. And unfortunately, our judicial bodies have no qualms about saying this. They've said it very openly a number of times already that, hey, if we started recognizing this as rape, that will be grounds for divorce, that will be grounds for this and that will destroy the institution of marriage in our country. And so we're not going to recognize it as rape. How disheartening is that?
Yeah, it's very, and the sad thing is that we couch a lot of other laws, like let's say the attempt at banning pornography, or in general, the moral police is constantly trying to say that they're interested in protecting women, right? We're protecting women. Let's tell women not to wear jeans and not to eat chow mein and not to use cell phones and all of this, as if we are interested in protecting women. But half the time, even the best efforts at trying to protect women actually only further curtail their autonomy, and where it would be really nice if we actually change the law to protect women, there seems to be no interest in changing things, right? Such as the case of the fact that marital rape is still legal. So it's very, I don't know, it's absurd. I feel like I don't want to get in any trouble, and I don't know whether this video is going to be made public on the internet. But if we really want to, discuss the nitty-gritties of the absurdities of certain policy-related things that happen, I feel like, you don't even need me to tell you this, right? There's a lot that needs to be done in terms of making, on a public policy level, there's so much misogyny, there's so much queer phobia, transphobia, invisibilization of certain identities, and all of that even in the way things are phrased and the way laws are phrased and the way cultural practices are implemented, are just considered like part of life, which it needn't be,
Mm-hmm. In fact, that brings me to the next question that I wanted to ask you again about consent. Going back to consent, but this time, let's think about how it might intersect in unique ways with queer identities. Do you think there's any interesting overlap or anything interesting that comes up when these two things interact with each other?
As someone who kind of just has lived as a straight kind of, I definitely feel like I'm at a place where I'm questioning the compulsory heterosexuality that I've inherited. I feel like for the majority of my life, I have occupied that identity. So I don't want to speak on behalf of, I don't think I have the personal lived experience or expertise to really talk about queerness and consent or how it changes things. But I would imagine that it's worth thinking about how constructions of masculinity and ideas around consent actually also permeate, for example, relationships between gay men. The unfortunate reality is that the perpetrators of sexual violence, statistically, regardless of the gender of the survivor, the perpetrators tend to be men. However, in fact, and particularly when it comes to, and again, sorry, but trigger warning, mention of abuse and maybe child sexual abuse, the victims or the survivors of sexual abuse, and particularly child sexual abuse, tend to not actually have a major gender sort of, in the sense, it tends to be an experience that whether the survivor is male or female, the prevalence of that experience statistically tends to be almost equal. Did I explain that correctly? So, and we never talk about male sexual abuse, but unfortunately it happens also to men at the hands of a male, happens to young boys and men at the hands of a male perpetrator. Does that make sense? And it's something we don't talk about, right? So I feel like constructions of masculinity, we're often talking about when this happening to, sexual violence happening to women, but it also happens to men. I think we also kind of don't really talk about the fact that the majority of sexual assault actually happens at the hands of somebody known to the victim. It's not some stranger in a dark alleyway, monstrous stranger. It's tempting to think of that as how it would be, but in fact, it's often a friend, family member, relative, somebody known to the victim, right? So we don't think about these things very much because it's not convenient to think about them. Maybe I've gone on a bit of a tangent. Perhaps it's not so directly related with queer experiences per se, but I feel like we often think of violence as within the heterosexual context only, whereas it can happen with, to people of any gender and any orientation. And it's worth considering that everybody deserves safety and safe spaces and resources to heal and all of that, right? And I think we see women as necessary victims. In fact, I feel like we posit women as victims in this strange sort of way, but actually, I feel like there should be, I think, more space for a variety of experiences to be publicly discussed and acknowledged, and for us to be able to talk about this stuff. Because, for example, I think abuse is something men don't talk about, even though they can be victims of it. Which is evidence that the patriarchy doesn't serve men. It doesn't serve men. At least we're talking about it now. I don't see the men talking about this as quite as much. So anyway.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We don't see men talking about it as much as is a fact.
There's I feel like vulnerability is so, men deny themselves opportunity to be emotionally honest or in any way perceived of as weak and all of this stuff. So I think there's so much we could do to help each other. I think so much we could do.
Mm-hmm. One intersection that I think is quite relevant to our conversation today as a part of this conference is how consent might interact in very unique ways with asexual and non-sexual identities. And from my experience, what I understand is that, like, for example, the model that you spoke about, right? That model actually is at some points in an asexual person's life just will fail them. It won't apply. I'm saying this because for a lot of asexual and or non-sexual people, different concepts though, but for many of them, sex is not sexual. I don't know if this is making sense because we haven't had that entire background of talking about asexuality in this conversation. But for a lot of asexual people, for a lot of non-sexual people, a lot of sexual activities are kind of like a bodily function sometimes. It's like scratching, and a lot of them will put it like that very clearly. And I don't think for them it's about sexuality, if that is making any sense. And I feel like in those kinds of scenarios, for example, that model of consent and many other models of consent just simply don't apply as a copy paste. I feel like they need to be contextualized to some extent. They need to be understood with a little more nuance and multiple layers above and beyond that model, which I think again comes from a very purist understanding of what a sexual encounter will be like. I feel like that doesn't necessarily apply to maybe other queer identities also, but definitely to many asexual people's relationships, in my experience. And when it comes to consent, a point that I do like to make about consent is that we always tend to speak about consent in terms of a per event basis, and in that per event basis, we allow for people to say yes or a no, and we try to at least talk about valuing that yes and that no, but only on a per event basis. We don't necessarily lend the same kindness or the same acceptance to somebody who wants to say no on a long-term basis or a forever basis. Somehow things seem to change when you put consent like that. That it's okay for somebody to say no to sex or sexual activity once or twice or this date or with this person. But if it's a blanket no, then somehow it becomes a little less okay, a little less acceptable. It's definitely not spoken about the way that per event or case basis consent is spoken about. Is that making any sense, Leeza?
Yeah, no, I do. But I would love to hear more from you because I feel like, I would love to learn, and you're definitely the one in the better position to be talking about this. So please continue. I think it's so valuable for us to talk about the nuances of consent within, the experience of asexuality. So please continue, because I feel like, individual experiences can be so unique, and yet you also want to be able to provide some valuable sort of general insights that somebody navigating identity might find helpful, right? So I would love to hear from you about what you think might be a more sort of helpful model that takes into consideration the likely experiences of somebody who is asexual.
Very interesting that you asked that, because I have no answer to it. I have no model in mind, which I think applies better to asexual people. But I definitely know that the same model again is not allowing for diversity in many ways. And this is probably a conversation, Leeza, you and I can have at another time, because it's also something I'm exploring actively and thinking about as we speak right now. So it's definitely, I think, interesting. It would be interesting to talk more about that and see if we can come up with some kind of a model that allows for that diversity. But it's been absolutely lovely speaking to you, Leeza. I personally feel intellectually so stimulated right now because I'm thinking of all these things that we don't usually talk about. So it's been a pleasure.
I hope we can do more, and I hope we can talk more about consent in the context of asexuality. Really, really interesting, and I would love to think about it more deeply. So I hope we can really do that. Maybe on my platform, I can have you as a guest soon.
For sure, for sure. It's been enlightening, and I'm taking a lot of things back from this conversation, from what is written in the chat box. It seems like a lot of people are. There's a lot of people who've agreed with a lot of what we've discussed, and some of them have mentioned how they're thinking about certain things for the first time, which is also my experience after this conversation. Leeza, on that note, I'll ask you if you have any closing comments or if you have any anything specific to say to PanACEa before we move on to the next session for tonight.
Thank you. I just want to say a huge thank you for organizing this, for creating space for these types of conversations, and for having me. And I hope that I can attend more of the events. It's just such a great conference, and thank you for doing this, Pragati. I'm really, really so thrilled to be part of this. Thank you.
Lovely. Have a great evening ahead then. Bye.
Bye.
Are we still live?
It shows we are.
Can you stop it, please?
I don't think I have that option. It still says we are live. How do I do this?
Give it a few seconds. It'll make you the host automatically in a bit.
Okay.